So, good day everyone. I am Mary Ann Zamora and with me are my groupmates, namely Miss Ella Pansupane and Miss Patria Ubusan. So, we will be learning about Lesson 12, International Trade, Theory, and Development Strategy. But before diving into that, let's take a look at this video.
Every day, a network of ships, trucks, and planes move massive quantities of goods around the world. Your car might come from South Korea, and your t-shirt from Bangladesh. All countries export, sell products and services abroad, and import, buy goods and services from foreign trading partners. These goods are manufactured items or agricultural commodities. Services, a dynamic and growing part of trade, refer to all intangible goods such as advertising and telecommunication. But the trade network is more complex than sellers and buyers. The system of worldwide trade is an intricate web in which lengthy supply chains allow products to be sourced, assembled, packaged, and sold in different parts of the world. The materials for your phone or shoes or the tuna fish you had for lunch might have been produced in one country, processed in another country, assembled in a third country, and packaged somewhere else, all before getting to your local store. How does this make sense? Why can't countries just make their own phones, shoes, or tuna fish and provide more jobs and business domestically? Before the 19th century, most European countries tried to do just that, prioritizing self-sufficiency in a system called mercantilism. Mercantilism aimed to maximize exports, minimize imports, and increase a country's supply of gold. This system led to strict tariffs, or taxes on imports, as a way to not only discourage bringing in goods from abroad, but profit off it. Mercantilism created barriers to international trade. Countries aimed to produce as much as possible on their own, including things they weren't able to make efficiently. In the late 18th century, so-called classical economists refuted these long-held beliefs, championing the idea that societies should trade with one another to be more successful because of comparative advantage. The idea that when countries focus on making things they're comparatively good at and import the rest, everyone benefits. This is known as specialization. And when countries don't have to spend time and resources producing textiles or wine, for example, there's more room for them to innovate and create entirely new products. These classical economists argued that it was counterproductive to judge a country's power on how much gold it could amass. Today, we measure countries and economies on productivity, their ability to utilize their limited resources for maximum value. This metric is known as gross domestic product, which totals the sum of all the final goods and services a country produces in a year. Each country's human, physical, technological, and financial resources determine what that country can produce efficiently and successfully. Costa Rica excels at exporting pineapples and coffee, while Germany exports millions of cars and computers. With the acceptance of these new ideas, international trade took off. Measuring GDP instead of just gold helped boost trade and grow economies. At the same time, advances in technology and travel made remote markets much more accessible. Massive container ships, cargo planes, and cheap, instantaneous communication connected the world's producers with millions of new customers. And after World War II, the newly formed United Nations created the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT. This agreement substantially lowered trade barriers like tariffs and created rules to dictate how countries should trade freely. The GATT became the World Trade Organization in 1995 and tried to eliminate even more obstacles to keep up with a changing world. The WTO expanded the definition of trade to include not just goods, but services, and to create rules governing intellectual property, such as copyright or a patent. The WTO is also an arena for countries to hammer out the rules and regulations of international trade and lodge complaints if they believe those rules aren't followed. According to the principle of comparative advantage, if one country can't sell a high-quality product at a reasonable price point, or new technology makes a business uncompetitive, it will not succeed. Its stores or factories might be forced to close, and jobs will be lost. That country must then adjust its economy around something it can be comparatively good at. This is the nature of international trade. However, some countries and industries are accused of skirting the rules of international trade, and that's where the WTO tries to come in. For example, in the United States, labor unions argue the WTO doesn't adequately protect U.S. wages from being undercut by unfair trade practices in China. And some developing countries say the WTO rules don't take into consideration their unique circumstances. For example, agricultural subsidies provided by wealthy governments make it hard for sellers from smaller or poorer countries to reasonably export their crops to those countries. The WTO has failed to solve these problems. They are especially hard to address because changes to the rules require consensus among the WTO's 164 member countries. Some countries forge bilateral and regional trade agreements to address their particular needs and trade strategies. In 1994, the North American Free Trade Agreement, known as NAFTA, was designed to facilitate more trade among the United States, Mexico, and Canada. NAFTA provided a blueprint for similar types of agreements between other countries. From just 1990 to 2015, world trade volume increased more than five-fold, from 3.5 trillion to 19 trillion. International trade has created a tightly interconnected world economy that's given more people than ever access to cheaper and better goods and services. It's created millions of jobs and strengthened international connections, leading to global stability. At the same time, trade can hurt those individuals, companies, and communities where imports make it impossible for local firms to compete against better or cheaper goods from somewhere else. Trade will inevitably create winners and losers, but it is inseparable from modern life. The challenge then for policymakers is to assist those who have been disadvantaged with support and the training for new jobs, so everyone can continue to benefit from the system that has given more choices to consumers and more work for producers in every corner of the world.
So for my part, it is comprised of three topics, which are the economic globalization as an introduction, international trade and its issues, and the international theory of international trade comparative advantage. We would also like to remind everyone of the twist we created for you to patiently learn while having the chance to win prizes. Naglagay po kami ng letters throughout the presentation. It is a praise na kailangan nyong masagutan after the presentation, and to the first two person who will win will get a 50 pesos worth of money. Kaya kailangan po nating makinig. And to deepen the ideas, I am here as the first presenter. I would like to ask a question first. Take a look at your clothes from head to toe. Where are your clothes from? Is it from the local market or from SM? Our clothes can be from different parts of the world. Its raw materials can be from China, USA, or India, which in fact, fabric being the fourth in the top most imported materials in the Philippines. That's just one proof of globalization. We may have tackled globalization several times, but today it is in the field of economics. Globalization is not new. Since the start of civilization, people have traded goods with their neighbors. As culture advanced, they were able to travel farther afield to trade their own goods for desirable products found elsewhere. Globalization is one of the most frequently used words in the discussion of development, trade, and international political economy. As the form of the world implies, globalization is a process by which the economies of the world become more integrated, leading to a global economy and increasingly global economic policy making. For example, through international agencies such as the World Trade Organization, globalization also refers to an emerging global culture. When we say global culture, in which people consume similar goods and services across countries and use a common language of business, which is English. These changes facilitate economic integration and are in turn further promoted by it. But in its core economic meaning, globalization refers to the increased openness of economies to international trade, financial flows, and direct foreign investment, which are topics of this and the following two chapters. The growing interconnection of all kinds, across national governments and firms, and directly between people is a process that affects everyone in the world, even if so far it still seems more visible in the developed countries. But globalization can, in many ways, have greater impact in developing countries. The potential downside of globalization is also greater for poorer countries if they have become locked into pattern of dependence. If dualism within developing countries sharpens, or if some of the poor are entirely bypassed by globalization. Critics have realized the legitimate worry that many people living in poverty could find it all hard to actually break out of poverty traps without concerted public action. For example, if human capital fell down, the minimum needed to engage the global economy, the share of international investment received by the poorest countries has not been on a long-term trend of falling rather than rising. Formal processes of trade liberalization have been key to the encouragement of globalization thus far. A significant series of rounds of trade negotiation were held under GATT, or the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, initiated in 1947, which led eventually to the creation of WTO in 1995. The trade rules negotiated under the process of WTO are key examples of how rules of the game are being created. So far, however, the rules has not been balanced. They have greatly benefited some countries but have benefited less poor countries still trying to gain a foothold in growth and development through agriculture and facing barriers put up by the very countries that are most promoting the benefits of trade openness. Trade protectionism, as practiced by developed countries, tend to fall most heavily on the poorest developing countries. Because developed countries, protection focuses on agriculture. The tariffs by developed countries on imports from developing countries, though currently not very high by historical standard. To create genuinely fair as well as efficient rules of the game, much more needs to be done. International agreements are needed to level the globalization playing field for the poor. Some of this leveling process involves international change, and some involves national changes that can be facilitated by the international community. For example, to prevent popping up corrupt governments that violate human rights and violent and exploitative rebels that stay in power through international trade in legal goods such as diamonds, as well as in illegal goods such as narcotics. Codes of conduct for multinational corporation regarding political and other behavior can be developed further. The reasonable limits on the applicability of international property rights must be agreed to, such as those concerning provision of life-threatening medicines in poor countries that cannot afford to pay monopoly rent, prices that far exceed production costs. It has also been asked whether more cannot be done for the poorest countries than merely leveling the playing field. Many development advocates are calling for more genuine and fuller opening of developed countries' markets to exports from the poorest countries. It may also be said that among the worst possible outcomes for a poor country is for the current round of globalization to bypass the country entirely. This is largely the situation in much of sub-Saharan Africa, although a number of countries have benefited substantially from the commodity boom of recent years. Nevertheless, adversely affected by previous waves of globalization, most countries in this region have been much less affected by the present wave. International trade has often played a central role in the historical experience of the developing world. As many other topics in development, there is a great deal of diversity in developing countries' experiences with trade. In recent years, much of the attention to trade and development issues has been focused on understanding the spectacular export success of East Asia. Taiwan, South Korea, and other East Asian economies pioneered this strategy, which has been successfully followed by their much larger neighbor, which is China. The experiences of these economies are an important plotline in the unfolding trade and development drama and will be examined later on furtherly in this chapter. At the same time, throughout Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America, primary product exports have been traditionally accounted for a sizable proportion of individual gross domestic products. In some of the smaller countries, a substantial percentage of the economy's income is derived from the overseas sale of agricultural and other primary products of commodities such as coffee, cotton, cacao, sugar, palm oil, bauxite, and copper. Because the markets and prices for export products are often unstable, primary product export dependence carries with a degree of risk and uncertainty that few nations desire. The country is considered to be commodity export dependent when more than 60% of its total merchandise exports are composed of commodities. Commodity dependence may not make the headlines of newspapers, but its effects does. When a country's economy is not diversified and relies heavily on basic products, it puts itself at mercy of international market prices. When prices go down, employment, exports, and government revenue suffers. In other words, putting too many eggs on one basket renders the countries vulnerable. UNCTAD's recent reports on the state of commodity dependence on 2019 assesses the current situation and analyzes its evolution over the past 20 years. The two main facts stand out is that the commodity dependence is mostly a developing country phenomenon. It is persistent. Once a country is in this state, it's hard to break the chains of this dependence. Commodity dependence is not rare. Around 54% of all countries, or 102 out of 189, are commodity dependent. However, only 30% of developed countries, including Australia, New Zealand, and Norway, are in this situation. In contrast, this increases the share to 64% of developing countries and is higher still at 85% for the world's least developed countries. In other words, export concentration of primary commodities is linked to underdevelopment. The higher the dependence, the lower the country's development. By measured its GDP per capita. In some cases, the dependence is extreme. There are 35 countries in the world for which more than 90% of their exports are commodities. For Angola, Iraq, Chad, Guinea, and Nigeria, this share surpasses 98%, and in some instances, a single product constitutes more than 3/4 of all exports revenue. The problem is not dependence per se, but the vulnerability it entails. We have here the 5 basic questions wherein we will eventually try to answer as we go on further the discussion. The first question is, how does international trade affect economic growth? How does trade alter the distribution of income? How can trade promote development? And can developing countries determine how much they trade? And is an outward-looking or an inward-looking trade policy the best? You may also refer to this part of the presentation a summary of the various positions in the ongoing debate between the trade optimist and trade pessimist, and between outward and inward looking strategies of development. Finally, we look at the trade policies of developed countries to see in what ways they directly and indirectly affect economies of the developing developing world. One of the key issues is the importance of export to different developing nations. Export often allows for greater economic activity, leading to higher revenue. It also may result in production efficiencies due to scaling manufacturing. It also results in greater innovation and R&D through working with foreign partners. And it also reduces operational risks in some areas as revenue streams become more diversified. But also, we may have to remember that it can result in high transportation charges, not achievable by smaller entities due to lack of knowledge and resources, and the result in currency exchange risk due to devaluating currencies. And also, it can increase operational risk in some areas due to unknown political and geographical risk. As one of the key issues, it also says here that export of developing countries are generally less diversified than those of developed countries. Look at the figure number 1. Plots manufacturing value added or the output as a percent of GDP for advanced economies, emerging markets, and resource rich countries. As shown here, the trends for emerging markets and resource-dependent countries are similar. This figure illustrates that manufacturing value added as a share of GDP changed little in advanced economies from 1990 to 2006, whereas emerging markets and resource-dependent countries experience far larger changes. The figure also shows that the manufacturing sector's contribution to GDP was about 14% in resource-rich countries in 1990. Since then, it has slightly declined, reaching approximately 11% of GDP in 2006. The manufacturing sector's share in GDP remained stable in advanced economies, while it lost some ground in the emerging markets. As industrialization takes place, the structure of the economy changes and countries' income grows, leading to improvements in standards of living. High-income countries are more industrialized, and the manufacturing sector's share in GDP is higher in these countries compared with less developed ones. As countries develop, the manufacturing and service sectors tend to grow faster compared with the primary sectors. It appears that the manufacturing sector in resource-rich countries has not been expanding along the path observed during the earlier stages of development in high-income countries. If this pattern is reversed, the structure of economy and resource-dependent countries will continue to be dominated by the non-tradable and mining sectors, thus hurting future growth prospects. Overall, research-rich countries made little progress toward increasing manufacturing share in GDP during the sample period. This figure is from the World Bank data actually. And for the figure 2, you may also see that it presents the dynamic of export diversification in advanced economies and emerging markets and resource-rich markets. The larger values of this index indicate less export diversification. The figure clearly demonstrates that resource-rich countries are far less diverse in the terms of for their export basket or the products they export, compared with the emerging markets and advanced economies. Furthermore, the trend in the export diversification index for resource-rich countries fluctuates during the sample period. Since the turn of the century, it began also to rise, reflecting improvements in commodity prices. This trend indicates that diversification efforts of these countries failed to produce measurably improvements between 1980 to 2006. Contrary to this trend, the diversification index in the emerging markets exhibited a downward trend, reflecting improvements in the export diversification index of these countries. The Export Diversification Index for advanced economies actually did not change. Another key issue is that merchandise export as a share of GDP are often higher for developing countries, which is agreed upon by the statistics presented in the screen. In 2021, the value of world merchandise exports increased strongly by 26.5% after 2 years after 2 consecutive years of decline. The global exports amounted to 22.3 trillion US dollars to 3.3 trillion US dollars higher than the pre-pandemic value recorded 2 years before in 2019. In 2022, the exports value is now cast to continue growing at a rate of 13.8% from 2021. Higher merchandise exports were recorded in the north than in the south in 2021. Developing economies contributed a 9.9 trillion US dollars and developed economies 12.4 trillion US dollars to the world total. Asia and Oceania accounted for 45% global merchandise exports, followed by Europe with 37% and America with 16%. Most statistical studies of world demand patterns for different commodity groups reveal that in the case of primary products, the income elasticity of demand is relatively low. The percentage increase in quantity of primary agricultural products and most raw materials demanded by importers will rise by less than the percentage increase in the gross national incomes. By contrast, for fuels, certain raw materials and manufactured goods, income elasticity is relatively high. For example, it has been estimated that 1% increase in developed countries' incomes will normally raise their imports of foodstuffs by a mere of 6% and of agricultural raw materials such as rubber and vegetable oils by 5%, but will raise imports of manufacturers by about 1.9%. Consequently, when incomes rise in rich countries, their demand for food products and raw materials from the developing nations goes up relatively slow. Whereas demand for manufacturers go up relatively rapid, the net result of these low income elasticities of demand is the tendency for the relative price of primary products to decline over the time. Moreover, since the price elasticity of demand, primary commodities also tends to be quite low or nagiging inelastic po siya. Any shifts in demand or supply curves and can cause large and volatile price fluctuations. Together, these two elasticity phenomena contribute to what has come to be known as export earnings instability. What is export earning instability? It is actually a wide fluctuations in developing countries. Earnings on commodity export resulting from low price and income elasticities of demand, leading to erratic movements in export prices. But how does this happen? Export earnings instability in developing countries is the result of a number of factors. First, many developing countries have specialized on the export of primary commodities, which are peculiarly susceptible to shifts in supply and demand, as well as being more price inelastic than are. For example, manufactured goods. Second, the exports of many developing countries are not only concentrated by sectors or the commodities, but also geographically, with obvious implication when linked to factors affecting to demand in the importing countries. Third, the markets for products in which developing countries have specialized are often characterized by speculation on the one hand and oligopoly on the other hand. Instability affects the development through such variables as imports, savings, and investment, employment, government revenues, and private income. Special name for the relationship or theory between the price of a typical unit of exports and the price of a typical unit of imports. This relationship is called the commodity terms of trade, and it is expressed as commodity terms of trade, which is P over PM, where P and PM represents the export and imports price indexes, respectively calculated on the same base period. The commodity each export price to its average terms of trade are said to deteriorate for a country if P over P falls. That is, if export prices declines relative to import prices, even though both may rise. Most scholarship has broadly confirmed that historically the prices of primary commodities have declined relative to manufactured goods. As a result, the terms of trade have on average tended to worsen over time for the non-oil exporting developing countries while showing a relative improvement for the developed countries. The main theory for the declining commodity terms of trade is known as the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis. After two famous development economists who first explored its implications in the 1950s, they argued that there was Prebisch-Singer hypothesis and would continue to be a secular or a long-term decline in the terms of trade. The argument that the primary commodity exporters, due to a combination of low income and commodity terms of trade for primary product exports of price elasticities of demand. This decline would result in an ongoing transfer of developing countries tend to get income from poor to rich countries that could be combated only by efforts to protect domestic manufacturing industries through a process that came to be known as import substitution. Both of this theory and because of the unfavorable terms of trade trends, and developing countries have been doing their utmost over the past several decades to diversity into manufacturers exports. After a slow and costly start, these efforts have resulted in a dramatic shift in the composition of developing country exports, especially among middle income countries. Unfortunately, this structural change has not brought as many benefits to most developing countries as they had hoped, because relative prices within manufacturers have also diverged. Over the past few decades, the prices of the basic manufactured goods exported by developing countries fell relative to the advanced products exported by rich countries. The price of textiles fell especially precipitously, and low-skilled and electronic goods were not far behind. The phenomenon of transactions and exchange is a basic component of human activity throughout the world. Even in the most remote villages of Africa, people regularly meet in the marketplace to exchange goods, either for money or for other goods through simple barter transactions. A transaction is an exchange of two things. Something is given up in return for something else. In an African village, women may barter food such as cassava for cloth or simple jewelry for clay pots. Implicit in all transaction is a price. Why do people trade? Basically because it is profitable to do so. Different people possess different abilities and resources and may want to consume goods in different proportions. Diverse preferences as well as varied physical and financial endowments open up the possibility of profitable trade. People usually find it profitable to trade the things they possess in large quantities relative to their taste or needs, in return for things they want more urgently, because it is virtually impossible for individuals or families to provide themselves with all the consumption requirements of even the simplest life. They usually find it profitable to engage in the activities for which they are best suited or have a comparative advantage in terms of their natural abilities or resource endowments. They can then exchange any surplus of these home-produced commodities for products that others may be relatively more suited to produce. The phenomenon of specialization based on comparative advantage arises, therefore, to some extent in even the most subsistence economies. These same principles of specialization and comparative advantage have long been applied by economists to the exchange of goods between individual and nations. In answer to the question of which goods are traded and why some countries produce some things while others produce different things, economists since the time of Adam Smith have sought the answer in terms of international differences in cost of production and prices of different products. Countries, like people, specialize in a limited range of production activities because it is to their advantage to do so. They specialize in activities where the gains from specializations are likely to be the largest. The concept of relative cost and price differences is basic to the theory of international trade. The principle of comparative advantage, as it is called, asserts that country should and under competitive conditions will specialize in the export of the products that it can produce at the lowest relative cost. So, to summarize, the factor endowment theory is based on the two crucial parts. First is different products require productive factors in different relative proportion. For example, agricultural products generally require relatively greater proportion of labor per unit of capital than manufactured goods, which require more machine time or the capital per worker than most primary products. The proportion in which factors are actually used to produce different goods will depend on their relative prices. But no matter what factor prices may be, the factor endowment model assumes that the certain products will always be relatively more capital intensive while others will be relatively more labor intensive. These relative factor intensities will be no different in India than in United States. Primary products will be relatively labor-intensive commodities compared with the secondary manufactured goods in both India and US. And the second one is that countries have different endowments of factors of production. Some countries like the US have large amounts of capital per worker and are therefore designated capital abundant countries. Others like India, Egypt, or Colombia have little capital and much labor and are designed labor abundant countries. In general, developed countries are relatively capital abundant, which one could also add that they are well endowed with skilled labor, while most developing countries are labor abundant. The factor endowment theory goes on to argue that capital abundant countries will tend to specialize in such products as automobiles, aircraft, sophisticated electronics, communication goods, and computers, which use capital intensively in their technology of production. They will export some of these capital intensive products in exchange for the labor or the land intensive products like food, raw materials, and minerals that can be best to produce by countries that are relatively well endowed with labor or land. This theory, which played a predominant role in the early literature and policy advice on trade and development, encouraged developing countries to focus on their labor and land intensively primary product export. It can argue that by trading these primary commodities for the manufactured goods that developed countries will theoretically best suited to produce. Developing nations could realize the enormous potential benefits to be had from free trade with the richer nations of the world. Little attention was given in this literature to diversification as an objective or the productivity benefits of expanding manufacturers' share. So we are now in a position to summarize the theoretical answers to our 5 basic questions about trade and development derived from the neoclassical trade model. First question: how does international trade affect economic growth? Trade is an important stimulator of economic growth. It enlarges a country's consumption capacities, increases world output, and provides access to scarce resources and worldwide markets for products without which developing countries would be unable to grow. For the next question, how does trade alter the distribution of income? Trade tends to promote greater international and domestic equality by equalizing factor prices, raising real incomes of trading countries, and making efficient use of each nation's and the world's resource endowments. Example of this is raising relative wages in labor-abundant countries and lowering them in labor-scarce countries. And third, how can trade promote development? Trade help countries achieve development by promoting and rewarding the sectors of the economy where individual countries possess a comparative advantage, whether in terms of labor efficiency or factor endowments. It also let them take advantage of economies of scale. For the fourth question, can developing countries determine how much they trade? In a world of free trade, international prices and cost of production determine how much a country should trade in order to maximize its national welfare. Countries should follow the principle of comparative advantage and not to try interfere with the free working of market through government policies that either promote exports or restrict imports. Lastly, is an outward-looking or an inward-looking trade policy the best? Finally, to promote growth and development, an outward-looking international policy is required. In all cases, self-reliance based on partial or complete isolation is asserted to be economically inferior to participation in a world of unlimited free trade. So that would be all for my presentation. I will be giving the table to the next presenter.